Stephanie Krantz will be presenting on issues facing tribes and rural communities. The learning objective, Stephanie will be presenting for 8 minutes as an interested party presenter. The learning objective is to learn about how climate change and action impacts rural communities' needs and rural economic development. Stephanie is a climate change adaptation planner, a climate reality leader, an ecologist, and a concerned citizen working for the Nez Perce tribe in La Pointe, Idaho. Maybe you can correct me on how I was pronouncing that. Thank you.
It's Lapway, and it's onomatopoeia for the sound of the flapping wings of butterflies.
Nice, thank you. Well, please take it away.
So I'm a climate change planner and an ecologist. I work for the Nez Perce tribe, as Derek so perfectly said. I'm also a resident of Clarkston, Washington. So I live on the far eastern edge of Washington, and I think that the rural areas of the state have the largest amount of land and the smallest population, but are still facing some incredible climate impacts. And that the rural parts of the state have a lot to do with climate mitigation. And so I just wanted to highlight these concerns and some of the experiences that we're having on the east side, and a few solutions. So these pictures are all from Eastern Washington. These are all impacts: roads washing out, sagebrush and farms on fire, extreme snow events shutting down cities, and whatnot. One thing that makes rural and Eastern Washington a challenge is poverty. 30% of the children in the community that I live in go home with backpacks full of food on the weekends. And rural Washington has a poverty rate of 13.2% compared to 9.4% in urban areas. And that was pre-pandemic. So now these numbers are worse. I just want to run through slides of some of the impacts. A lot of the communities in Eastern Washington are actually in floodplains. And so we have a lot of infrastructure that is going to have to be relocated because of frequent flooding. We're having incredible blowing snow events that are shutting down highways, a lot of rain on snow events that are causing extreme precipitation and flooding. Heat is going to be a major concern in the future for Eastern Washington. On the east side, there will be 15 to 50 days with a heat index above 100 degrees. On the west side, only 1 to 8. And this is an example of education for farm workers that unfortunately is not in Spanish, but shows that, highlights the fact that farm workers are particularly vulnerable to extreme heat. Wildfires, last summer, the town of Malden was burned to the ground in a single day. The same day I had a fire start in my backyard. We had extreme winds and hundreds of fire starts all over Eastern Washington. A lot of farmers have had impacts from farms to their wheat and cattle operations. And then here's a picture from the Colville Reservation showing a wildfire right in their housing. Air quality has been a big issue for us because when the fires start in Northern California, it seems like we just get their air within a couple days, and it just sits and bakes us in terrible air quality. And some of the things that are missing from rural communities that are easier to come by in urban areas are indoor play areas, air quality shelters, financial support for in-home air, and support for asthmatics who often have to travel far to get medical attention. The 2015 drought year is, a lot of climate scientists say, going to be what it's like in the future on an average year. And that year, Washington farmers lost 700 million in productivity. Washington State produces most of the nation's apples, and in the future, it'll actually be more favorable for producing apples throughout the interior basin. But apple trees are high value crops that take a long time to be productive. And when you lose your trees, it can be really devastating for farmers. I just wanted to quickly highlight that two tribes, the Colville and the Yakima, are two of the largest landowners in Eastern Washington and have already done a lot for climate mitigation, in part because they are experiencing these impacts. You know, the Colville Reservation has had a number of incredible fires that they lost housing, they lost forests, they lost 20% of their merchantable timber. The Yakima has also had impacts to their agricultural productivity. And, you know, the Spokane tribe has had terrible fires that harmed their housing developments, et cetera. So tribes that are already taking action. The Colville, Umatilla, Spokane, and Yakima tribes all have solar projects, and I think there's more coming with other tribes. And I'm mostly talking about the far east side of the state. Obviously, there's other tribes on the east slope. And one of the things I really wanted to highlight is that even though Eastern Washington has a small population, we could have an inordinate impact on solving the climate crisis because we manage so much land. So a mere 2% of increase in the carbon content of the planet's soils could offset 100% of greenhouse gases going in the atmosphere. And there are a lot of farmers here that are trying out new things, partly because they are trying to improve their soil health, and Regenerative International and Holistic Management International and other groups have been working with farmers. Here's another example. There are farmers planting perennial wheat, which has much deeper roots than annual wheat and is a great way to help us mitigate for floods because it allows the landscape to absorb more water. So there are now initiatives to try to help farmers become a part of the climate solutions and for food security and soil health, which are major issues for Eastern Washington, as most of our food is produced for export. I just wanted to point out a few needs and a few opportunities. Rural Washington needs jobs. Poverty reduction programs especially are important for children here. Local food production for local consumption is truly needed. You know, Eastern Washingtonians brag about feeding the world, but they're not doing a very good job of feeding themselves and their children in some cases. There's definitely a need for capacity building, for planning and emergency management. There is hardly any climate change planners on this side of the state. Climate education that's relatable to Eastern Washingtonians and to rural folks. Innovative water management and fish recovery is really important for our economy. We also need snowplows. It's incredible. The town I live in does not have enough snowplows. And when we get these extreme snows, literally your neighbors are plowing the roads with their big trucks. Opportunities, there's a huge amount of land and good solar and wind resources. There's already big wind farms in Eastern Washington, a lot of open land for large scale renewable energy. I already mentioned carbon sequestration. We're going to have a longer growing season and we'll probably start growing crops for more of the United States. You know, we have strong social networks and people really banded together and took care of each other during this pandemic. It was incredibly impressive. And then tribals leadership, you know, tribes are really taking the lead in the interior Columbia River Basin on climate change to try to save fish and the resources that they care about the most. And they're entering the renewable energy world in a big way. And here's a picture of some of the beautiful landscapes in Eastern Washington. And I just wanted to say thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce Shelley Vendiola. She'll be presenting on a way forward with lessons from the Swinomish Climate Resilience Project. She'll be presenting as an expert presenter for 15 minutes. The learning objective is to learn about tribal climate mitigation efforts through community engagement. Shelley Vendiola is the co-founder of the Native Community Engagement and Peacemaking Project, providing facilitation, community engagement strategies, and training. Shelley, if you're ready, can you take it away?
Thank you. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So, Oti Gulapu, Hat di Siaya, Hat di Ishid, Hagalitsa Sistad, Swaraps Chud. My friends and relatives, good morning. My ancestral name is Hagalitsa. I am Swarap, Swinomish. I come from the Swinomish tribe. We're located just 90 miles north of Seattle and just below British Columbia. And I want to thank Stephanie for your awesome presentation and representing some of the tribal groups over there on the east side of the mountains. We had a pretty strong trade route, and it still exists today between our relatives east of the mountains. And what I'm going to be speaking to you about is this climate change resilience project that our tribe has been working on, going on 22 or 12 years. And we formed a community interest group, a tribal community interest group, which is pretty unique in that we are formalized under the Department of Environmental Protection at the Swinomish tribe. And so I'm going to be approaching this from our Indigenous worldview. I'm going to be talking a little bit about our rights and this honorable community engagement strategy, and hopefully leave you with some tips for strengthening relationships. So here's our project. The first part is our adaptation plan update from the past 10 years, lessons that we've learned and witnessed, and then developing curriculum, a way forward toolkit that we can share with others who may have an interest. So I want to speak about our Indigenous worldview for a moment, and what we're, how we approach our work and how we approach, our need for building relationships is that we understand that we are of Mother Earth. We have the same DNA, the same fluids, liquids, and minerals, and that we are place-based as Indigenous people. So we are all Indigenous to the earth, for example. We happen to have ancestors from this place we call Swinomish, which is the people of the salmon. We are river people. We fish the river and we fish at the mouth where the Salish Sea meets the river, the Skagit. Skagit has 5 species of salmon, unlike any other river. So we have a vested interest in protecting what we feel is our sustenance and our medicine. And an example of how we approach our work is through our traditional knowledge. This is ancient knowledge, and evidence is what's on these story poles. The first icon you see is our origin story. The next icons, and you read this going from the bottom up, is our medicine, which we use in our ceremonies. And you see the blackfish and all our relatives that give us strength. And on the top, you'll see the eagle. The eagle represents the victory. It represents a way forward, the vision for the future, because it can see far. So that's where the 7th generation thinking come into play. And you've heard some of this before, but I'm just going to repeat it because I think it's really important that we all understand that tribes were created under the Department of War, at that time Interior Affairs, and that it was to colonize and own land, which we never seen land as property before. And then a lot of our young children were forced into boarding schools where they were beat and pretty much forced to learn a different way of thinking and to pick up a different creator or God. And so there was a lot of hurt. And so that brings us to our treaties, which were created in the mid 1800s. 1855 is our treaty, Point Elliott. And I want to pay particular attention to that Article 5, which says tribes have the right to hunt, fish, and gather in their usual and accustomed places forever. So our young people are asking, is this even possible? Because we wrote a contract with our government that said that we would have this in trade for massive amounts of land that the settler colonists could then create a life and lifestyle and living. So that brings us to the treaty rights that have often been dismissed, diminished, or broken. And we see that play out in the form of what Eisenhower called the military industrial complex, where the corporations and the government meet and what their decisions are enforced by the military. And so other resources that are violent acts on the earth and the indigenous people are the Athabascan tar sands, the Dakota Access Pipeline, Keystone XL Pipeline, Trans Mountain Pipeline right here in British Columbia that will transport all of that oil to March Point. And March Point is located on Swinomish ancestral territory. And that was taken from us by President Grant, who by executive order decided that that part, the north end of the reservation, would not be included as part of the reservation. And so here today, we find ourselves with 2 oil refineries and we're downwind from that. And so we have a very vested interest in educating and raising awareness about our pressing issues, as well as what Stephanie was talking about. Many of the tribal leadership have been watching and meeting at the table to discuss what this huge, humongous crisis is in front of us. And so we want to be really informed and not be fooled and not go into quick decision-making over things that may not be sustainable. And so what we're finding from a natural law and indigenous knowledge perspective is that this research that's being conducted, that there's no real conclusive evidence as of yet, and that it's the corporations and researchers' word that we're really dependent on here. And so that's concerning. So from our position, there is no such thing as clean coal, that carbon pricing, you hear the terms cap and trade, RED plus, carbon sequestration, those are systems that continue to pollute, and that these schemes are not compatible with natural law, a clean and healthy environment. Here's our reservation, and as you can see, we are surrounded by water. And so one of the burning issues is sea level rise. As you can see here, this is the town of Laconnor, and you see a lot of the red, which is the inundation. We are living in an area that has been severely impacted of late. And so here's a report, it's a dated report of '06. Climate impacts are very visible. Low-lying areas like the Skagit River Delta, in which we reside, will be one of the first affected. Sea levels appear to be rising faster than projected. Our community engagement concerns are that many negotiations continue without meaningful participations by tribal nations or indigenous people, and that free, prior, and informed consent is needed, and tribes should have appropriate representation at the table, wherever that table is, and a need for genuine and effective engagement of the rights or stakeholders in the development and implementation of policies. So I am very thankful that you all are here today and that you are willing to educate. So back then, when we first started down this road over 12 years ago, our tribe created a proclamation that prioritized climate change. We came up with an adaptation plan. This is 2010. Because we have, as Stephanie was saying, much of our wealth comes from the sea, much of our wealth comes from the forest. And so we still harvest from those places. We live off the land and we live off the forest, and it's changing and it's becoming toxic and it's going away. And so we're still in this struggle and fight for our lives. Here's the change in the habitat and structure, the impact of sea level rise and storm surges. It's had everything to do with our tribal sovereignty, our cultural land use, our self-determination. And so the challenges for Swinomish, as well as other tribal communities, are this, that protecting treaty rights and cultural sovereignty is at utmost importance, that connection to the reservation and homelands requires response and limits our options, because we don't seem to be going anywhere since we are indigenous to this place, and that we have many cultural practices and traditions that feed our spirit and help us to be strong, that mitigation efforts are well beyond our tribe's contribution, and that there's a great need for preparation to adapt. I like what this says in the governor's carbon emissions reduction task force. The tribal concerns that were listed on there, cap and trade systems have a high uncertainty and volatility in the costs. Tribes experience with the state's politically based mishandling of fish consumption rates and acceptable cancer rates in setting water quality standards was problematic. Both the carbon tax and the cap and trade approaches have weaknesses. So we are very concerned once the issues are clear, how do we organize? So this is what we're doing in our tribe. We are organizing our community with this interest group. We're using every strategy of organizing that we could muster up, including the direct services, education, litigation, and direct action. So the first thing is know your own culture. We understand that we have been colonized and that there are settler colonists here. We are willing to share and understand because we know that it builds empathy, trust, and friendship, and that translation is necessary. My uncle always says it's always a matter of semantics because we're speaking different languages and coming from different worldviews. Thus, policies or protocols should be created to create cultural understanding and a way forward together. So I just wanted to share a little bit about our traditional values. So one is compassion, connection, continuity, and community. Compassion has to do with what we say, huchusada in our Dwalashutsi language. It's traditions of the heart. It's respect. It's being loving, caring, and sharing. That's how we walk in the world at Swinomish. Connection has to do with listening to understand, listening to nature, listening to the earth, listening to each other. Continuity has to do with continuous action, hard work, determination, and integrity, as you see with our canoe families lifting a very heavy canoe out of the water. And then community has to do with our selfless, holistic worldview that says that the welfare of our community comes first over self, like we're seeing a lot of our essential workers in this pandemic today. And so those values are connected to our inherent rights. We understand that as Swinomish, that the language Dwalashutsi has built within it our protocols and our traditional values. Even the term Huchusada, which is traditions of the heart, is meaningful. That ceremonies are seen through our songs, our stories, our Indian names that are connected to the earth. That our children, our elders come first, and that education, we own our own education. We should be the ones to teach our children in the manner that is most appropriate. So far, we've seen the public school system leave a lot of our history out of the books that our children read. And utmost importance is the health and environment, which is clean water, food, medicines, and of course, the sacred sites on the earth. So we see our inherent rights are these things that are listed here are our birthrights. And therefore, these are sacred obligations to protect. We come from a community that's about we. So in our Lachutsi language, we have very few words about conflict, force, war, fighting, but we have a lot of words that have to do with cooperation, interchange, exchange, teamwork, working together. We come from a community that is used to gifting people and honoring people for even coming to visit us. So we come from that kind of culture, the culture of we. We're in this together. In our public education and presentation, we ask this question: how is fossil fuel extraction and pollution impacting your community? Like you're all learning today, right? So it's looking at the power structure really. And then we continue to try and practice as best we can our annual clam bake. We're teaching our own how to do that, how to preserve that part of our culture. We're going into the public school system and sharing a little bit about our traditional knowledge. In the Western world, it's called traditional ecological knowledge, but we know that's ancient knowledge. And so I really like what our Children's Trust is doing. This is a quote from a lawsuit that 12 young activists that you probably are familiar with already. This plaintiff, Kaylani, she's 13, and she says that her rights as a Native person are being taken away because of climate change. And so are the camas, huckleberry, salmon, and other traditional foods. They're disappearing, as we spoke about earlier. So
Kelly, just really quickly, a time check about, we're about at time. So if you could share your concluding thoughts.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So we know that this expression of our nation's values are beginning to be picked up. And one example is the Yurok tribe in the Klamath River. It's reflected in its tribal laws, White Earth Band of Ojibwe, or establishing legal personhood for their wild rice. So there's things that there are different ways that we can protect what gives us sustenance. And so we have a lot of publications. I wanted to call attention, especially to this since time immemorial, which is a state mandated curriculum about Washington tribes. And if you haven't already been familiar with that, if you're a teacher or no teachers, please have them take a look at that. And then there's legal frameworks for what I've been talking about, the rights of non-humans that are already being utilized. And so hence, here's a march and rally at March Point, which is where those 2 oil refineries are located. This is a water ceremony. This was at a march. So our group continues to raise awareness as best we can, because we want to move from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy in a good way and in a smart way. And so there's a few strategies that I have for you. You will be able to look at these in more detail. But I wanted to also emphasize that there is this Growth Management Act. It's a partnership on state and tribal planning initiatives. That's really important to pay attention to. And lastly, that promoting and investing in clean air and water and the earth for all requires that we take careful look at what these climate resolutions are that are coming forward. I did share this template that we are sharing with other tribes, if you want to take a look at that. And so with that, I'm just going to quickly. So I just want to say, us boot boot lachi, beat the booth lacha. Thank you all for listening.
Shelley, thank you so much. I really appreciate getting a chance to hear from you again. So I'm going to introduce Todd Mitchell, who's presenting on what does local climate mitigation and community engagement look like. He'll be presenting as an expert presenter. He's graciously reduced his presentation slightly to accommodate for some time. The learning objective is going to be learn about tribal climate mitigation action and how tribes can engage and leverage the state for ambitious climate policies. Todd is the director of the Swinomish Department of Environmental Protection. He has worked as a geologist and indigenous scientist researching the tribe's water resources. Todd, if you're ready, please take it away. Looking good, Todd.
Okay. So yeah, I like when I can work and follow my fellow tribal member, Shelley Mendiola. She sets things up well, so I can get to some nuts and bolts about engagement with state and tribal mitigation work. So like you saw many weeks ago, presentation by Preston Hardison, and I think that set things up well, talking about tribal sovereignty. So I'll dive a little bit deeper into state relations, well, quickly, and talk about that. So as you've probably seen here and there, that our tribes are really tied to our natural resources. So they nourish our bodies, they nourish our communities, and they really preserve our culture. So, you know, a lot of our work relies on the knowledge of our ancestors. We also combine it with traditional modern type science to protect our resources and our environments and our habitats, not just for now, but for the next 7 generations. So, you know, our tribes work for the survival of our resources and their places in our cultures. So, you know, all of our modern work and political work stems from our treaties. So Shelley said our treaty is the Treaty of Point Elliott, which is the eastern side of Puget Sound. And the most, really one of the most important clauses in there is the right of hunting, gathering, and fishing in our usual accustomed grounds. So you take a look at a map of Washington, and this one shows the areas of ceded territory, the territories the tribes gave up in their treaties. and moved to reservations back in the 1850s. So based on the treaty, the tribes have interests still within their usual custom areas, their ceded areas. So you can see for Point Elliott Treaty area, spans from down south all the way to the border. But you can see the other areas for other tribes, cover, the rest of the state. So when treaties are known and when treaties are honored, then the resources are protected for all. So like I said, our tribal cultures and often economies are based off of fishing. When fish are plentiful, our cultures are sustained. And for tribes, natural resources and fisheries, are not just a niche industry. They are our way of life. So when we're able to have good runs and good catches, our spirits and our cultures are sustained. Our traditions continue. So fishing for tribes, wasn't always that way. So for over 100 years, from the time of the treaty to the 1960s, 1970s, the relations with the state and tribes were strained. So there is a series of many, many court decisions leading up to this decision, the UV versus Washington in the 1970s, also known as the Bolt decision. And it reaffirmed our tribe's treaty reserved fishing rights to fishing in our usual custom areas. Fishing within Puget Sound, fishing within our watersheds, our rivers, where we had always fished. So, I think Preston said that well, treaty reserved rights were rights that the tribes always had, not something bestowed on the tribes by the government, United States government or the state government. We had those rights. We continue to have them. In this decision, it was set up where the tribes, we are co-managers of the fisheries. We have rights to 50% of the fish harvest. So through that, the tribes set up the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission to be that management group for the tribes in Western Washington. So you hear a lot of talk right now about putting a statue of Billy Frank Jr. In the Capitol. He was at the forefront of these fish wars back in the 1960s. Trying to reassert our treaty rights back in the 1960s. So he's very well revered by all of our tribal people because of the work he did and continued to do. He was the chairman of the Fish Commission right up until he passed away several years ago. So that's not the only case that came about. This is also a culmination of many court cases leading up to the Supreme Court decision on the Culverts case. So, part of the treaty means, having fish available, splitting and managing the fisheries, but that the habitat for those fish must be maintained as well. So, leading up to that case, there's a lot of culverts. Culverts are pipes underneath structures, usually roads, to allow water to pass through. So you can see on the right side, there's a culvert which does not allow fish passage. It's perched, it's narrow, it's long. On the left, you can see one that's more fish friendly. So this culverts case was to make sure that treaty rights for habitat for fish, so fish can be available for harvesting, was maintained. So with that, there's over 800 fish blocking culverts under roads in the state that need to be replaced to maintain habitat, actually open up habitat again that was blocked. So tribes, yeah, we're not in these things alone. Since the end of the 60s, which was the end of the US government's termination policies for tribes, tribes have been able to really be, sovereigns and governments, build their own communities, build their own governments. And tribes work together in many different facets, within their fisheries, within economic development. We are related, really, very closely. We have brothers and sisters, aunt and uncles among all of our tribes. So many times we work together in managing our resources and working together. So those were times when, the treaties may not have been well understood, and that led to conflict. But moving forward, relations have been better. And culmination of many meetings and consultations, the state and tribes developed the Centennial Accord, which started in 1989, in which the state set up laws for government-to-government relationships between tribes and the state, but also directing state agencies to collaborate with tribes, as it says here, when agencies develop policies, agreements, or implement programs that directly affect tribes. So this is a consultation process where, as Preston said, we are doing, free and informed consultation before these kind of laws are put into place. Tribes don't need to react to it after it's been in place for a long time. We are there talking about them as they are developed and moved along. So local level, we've done things also for Swinomish. We work with our county in developing comprehensive land use planning. Reservations are checkerboards of ownership, so tribes and local jurisdictions have to work together. Also for Swinomish, we've also worked with state parks. We have an innovative co-management and co-ownership agreement for an island on the reservation. So relations, they can work. So tribes, yeah, we have lots of issues with our natural resources and climate change. Not just our natural resources, but our infrastructure, utilities, people's houses, people's roads are under threat from sea level rise, storm surge. So Shelley showed, many tribes have climate adaptation policies and action plans, and Swinomish is one of those. So we're looking at various areas of, how we prioritize what are most sensitive resources. Can these resources be moved? Can we grow them, move them somewhere else? Restoration, can we make these natural resources more robust to climate change by increasing habitat? And especially education, we want to teach and engage our community in what is climate change and what we can do and what they can do. So we have education opportunities for our youth. We want to start with our youth, the next generation, the immediate next generation. So I kind of sum it up, climate change really does affect us all. But an understanding of treaties helps us all work together. Continue to improve government-to-government relations, the consultation process before policies are developed and implemented. And yes, tribes, we have unique challenges since our natural resources are closely tied to our culture. But protection of natural resources throughout the state it benefits everybody in the state. So we're all in this together. So hopefully we can work and improve things in the face of climate change. So I thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Todd. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Stephanie. Lift my hands up to you all for sharing these words and for being in this space with us. I apologize that it has to be like stuck into these time frames. That it'd be great to just be able to speak freely and as long as needed. But and we do have just a few minutes. We have time for a few questions. And feel free to pass on any question if you want to move on. There's a number of them. So the first question is from Travis in Snohomish for you, Shelley. What enforcement or repercussions are there for countries, states, cities, and corporations breaking treaties with tribes and indigenous peoples?
Right. So, so when I spoke about treaties being broken, just about every treaty has been broken, and there's very little repercussions as a result of one breaking one's contract or promise. In this case, it has everything to do with that military industrial complex I spoke about. So if you connect the dots to who's really running the country, and I'm just going to say that when we are asking for a seat at the table, that means that, as you've seen in Todd's presentation, that there are 29 tribes and there's more non-recognized tribes, which means they don't have necessarily a relationship with the federal government that the tribes that signed that 1855 treaty do. So that gives us a little leverage, and it can, we continue to litigate. We continue to have to bring entities to court. And so that is how we're seeing some of the wins, like that 50% of the catch, when in fact our treaty, Article 5, says that we would have access to our usual and accustomed places. We don't.
Well, thank you, Shelley. It's a challenging topic, and so thanks for addressing it. Stephanie, for you, Robert from Bellingham, can you please share examples of carbon sequestration?
Sure. So the biggest place where carbon rests is in the ground. Most of the carbon on our planet is actually soil-based and underground. And, only a small percentage of that is in the air, and a slightly larger percentage of it is in the biosphere. So the greatest sink for carbon so far has been the oceans and the soils. Agriculture is the largest human land use. And so a lot of the carbon that's in the atmosphere is actually from different forms of agriculture and ranching. And, farmers have figured out that using traditional knowledge, ancient knowledge, et cetera, that they can really improve their soil health and their resilience if they change the way that they farm. So that includes, instead of taking apart the system of grasslands and grazers, put those back together and manage them as if there's predators chasing cows around or other grazers. Adding compost back to the soil, covering as much soil as possible, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of research on different forms of carbon sequestration. So everything from soil health, which I think would be the easiest and fastest way to do it with the least amount of technology and the greatest benefit, because it increases the health of many things, not just the climate. Kiss the Ground is an organization that's completely devoted to, like, a PR firm for the earth that advocates for regenerative ag and soil health measures. And so they have some really great videos that are very educational, and that's a good way to look. And then I put some talks by some scientists in the chat. Other examples, people are doing things like trying to do carbon capture with machines, trying to do it with algae. you know, trying to actually build it into concrete, you know, planting forests, planting trees is one of the best ways that any individual could, you know, capture carbon, but you can also have a regenerative lawn or a pollinator garden. Anything with deep-rooted crops. And the way that I explain this to most people is if you took a prairie and turned it upside down, the root systems would be. But we've turned all of our prairies into annual cropping systems with roots that are 1 to 3 feet tall or 3 feet long. The Land Institute in Kansas has now backcrossed annual wheat to perennial wheat, and they have wheat that's got roots that's 15 feet deep. So the difference between water hitting the ground where roots are 15 feet deep and 2 or 3 is huge. You know, prairies are giant sponges that hold water and carbon. And when we care for our grasslands and prairies and forests, when water hits the ground, it doesn't run off and flood.
Yep.
So is filtered, etc. So, you know, that's just like a very brief explanation of that. Yeah, and then the other thing is big trees put on more carbon every year. They just slab on the carbon. The bigger they are, the better, and they're more likely to survive wildfires and have that carbon go up in smoke. And so, you know, it's really important to not only think about mitigating our energy, but, you know, by changing from fossil fuels to more renewable energy. But it's also very important to figure out how we're going to get the excess carbon out of the atmosphere and get back to 350 parts per million or below. So that's just my basic quick spiel about that. There's a lot of resources to learn more, and I can share them.
Okay, thank you so much.